want to say that, again, this idea that we can objectively determine workers' positions is different than the historical differentiations that folks have made based on occupational engagement or authority relations, or on especially the material-mental labor divide or the productive-unproductive divide. Increasingly in advanced societies, workers don't produce anything that's tangible, but that doesn't mean that they're not workers. And I don't actually think that all of even Marx's work indicates that the material-immaterial divide is a good way to differentiate workers. So, given the scope of global relations, and I guess now I'm actually talking about the paper itself more clearly, given the scope of global relations and the amount of variance in the possible activities that workers may engage in and the ways that workers may confront capital in its various forms, I want to first use physical mobility relative to nation states and regions, and second use the scope of workers' labor power expenditure relative to the circuits in which they are engaged, to determine where in the proletariat workers fit. So the first fraction I have sort of categorized as the dynamic global fraction, and that moves in. Right now I'm just going to deal with the global fractions, not necessarily in the local ones, because I think they're essentially analogs to the global fractions with certain important differences. But the first fraction is the dynamic global fraction, and this fraction of the working class is composed of workers whose productive activities and the products they deal with are geographically diffuse relative to firms and nation states. So these are people who are mobile in their everyday work. Their labor power is expended at multiple points in production chains, not just in terms of the commodities that they may or may not produce per se, but in terms of the places that they actually produce these goods, or the places in which they engage the firm's customers, etc. In general, I think these workers operate at the highest level of the class hierarchy, not only in terms of their compensation, but in terms of their rights. And I think Saskia Sassen talks a great deal about, or talks appropriately about the types of people who are literally above the state. They operate outside of nation state constraints. So those are essentially the people that I'm talking about. But some workers in this group, I think you can look at journalists or airline workers, just in terms of the sort of categorical approach that I'm using. Transportation workers in general also fit into this, because they're able to cross borders more freely and dynamically than workers who don't have these rights. So the value-added activities in which these workers in the dynamic global fraction engage happens across borders and within firms, and they are the most transnational of the transnational fractions. They move pretty flexibly. So the static global fraction, which I think actually constitutes the largest portion of workers in the global system, is composed of workers whose activities are fixed in terms of the places that they're able to work, in terms of the places that they actually reside or are fixed to. But their products move in a very diffuse manner from point to point in the production chains. So the labor power is expended at single points, but at single points in the production chain, but it also functions cumulatively with other workers in that same production chain. Workers in this fraction range from product designers, copywriters, maquila workers. They could be call center workers who communicate with customers from different regions as the day moves from time zone to time zone in a 24-hour cycle. In the paper, I identified specifically like members of the Screenwriters Guild, localized transportation workers that go from point to point. The value-added activities that workers in this fraction engage in happen within borders individually, but across borders collectively. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. Their products successively move from point to point throughout the chain of production. And finally, there are, let's see, before I move on, I think class antagonisms in a transnational sense can be most acutely observed in the static global fraction. Workers know that the reach of their products are variable, that the markets in which the products are going to be consumed are variable. They know that there are going to be great differentiations in the conditions of consumption that they enjoy relative to the people who are going to be consuming the products. And I think it's in this situation that alienation itself can be transnationalized. The workers' detachment from the product actually transcends political borders. It actually, operates across the chain in ways that I think are similar to national situations or localized situations. Moving on, the diasporic global fraction is that fraction of workers whose activities are geographically diffuse as a consequence of their own cross-border migration. And they may or may not be working within firms, but they are definitely diffuse relative to nation states. This is the fraction that I think most folks are concerned with when they talk about transnational workers. Migrants and diasporas are pretty, I think, dominant in the literature. Regardless of the inducement to move, obviously labor power is expended by workers in multiple geographic points, like I said, and there may be reasons to move, more or less permanently, but I think it's important to, I think it's important to differentiate these workers from workers in the upper echelons, and workers from the dynamic global fraction, because they don't enjoy the rights that the dynamic workers enjoy. They're extremely restricted relative to nation states. They're almost super exploited relative to firms. So they might be mobile, but they are not. They're not mobile in a legal, legitimate sense. Though I think there's certainly a lot of flexibility that goes on within that fraction in a sort of unofficial degree. So to sum up, the fractions of the global working class. Now, if I not to sum up quite yet. Again, I think the analogs of the local fractions are basically analogs of the categories that I've discussed in terms of dynamic local, static local, and diasporic local. And there are lots of reasons that folks might be mobile within nation states for their work, or there are lots of reasons folks may have to relocate, like Katrina, as I mentioned, Hurricane Katrina, like I mentioned in the paper. But considering the audience, I think the transnational fractions are more interesting at this point. So in sum, these fractions can be divided into two broad segments, transnational and local. The transnational include the dynamic global, the static global, and the diasporic global. Local are dynamic local, or static local, and diasporic local. And again, these fractional determinations are based on the worker's ability to move relative to nation states and regions, and secondly on the geographic scope of the worker's labor power expenditure. So again, that's the way products move successively in the circuit.